You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Wednesday evening, folks. Welcome to the program. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio, and of course all the different outlets where you can hear this program. Conversely, we have a visual of this program, the simulcast. Hello, I can talk today. The simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel. And that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the chat room. See, my talking is on a high par today. Join the chat room and the other Intrepids that follow this show. You can express your opinions there. You can talk. You can meet some good people who are fellow listeners to this program. So thanks for being here. Tonight we're going to dig into some kind of weird, mysterious stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about, since we started talking about the temple, which led us to talking about the road, the street of Pontius Pilate yesterday, that he built from the lower city of David all the way up to the temple walls. And since there's a couple of other things before we get into actually talking about the temple, which was the original intent yesterday, I want to lead off onto a little side thing. The man who built the first temple, King Solomon, the supposed son of David, out of David, the second king of Israel, but who raised Israel to its greatest power and expansion. And his son Solomon, who was supposed to have been the wisest, imbued by God with wisdom. God came and asked him, "What is it that you would like, Solomon? I'll give you anything of your heart's desire." And he said, "To be wise and wiser than any man." And God supposedly, as the story goes, gave him this wisdom. Now you can believe in these things by faith, that God was there, God was active, and God did these things. Also, even believing in Solomon for some people. By belief, I mean believing something that there is little evidence to support, although there is some evidence. There's some scant evidence, and so it's always been up in the air as to whether the man really existed. But as the man who built the first temple in Jerusalem in the 10th century BCE, I want to look at this guy and talk about a couple of mystical things, such as the Ring of Solomon, the sealed Ring of Solomon. So we're going to get into that in a minute, but before we do, I want to show you a couple of pictures. If you're listening audibly, you're not going to be able to see them, but that's okay. This is just a self-advertisement. I want to show you something I just got, and of course, I left it in the outside the studio, so I can't retrieve it right now. How's that for being prepared? But the new Intrepid mug. This is the artwork right here that I'm putting up. That's the art that wraps around the 15-ounce ceramic mug, and it says Intrepid radio program. It's got the Buck Rogers style rocket ship that we've adopted, that I created that art back in 2010. And it's got the boldly going phrase, which was the original phrase for Intrepid magazine before I launched the radio show. And you can look at that, and here's the mug itself. You can find it over on my Etsy page, and that's etsy.com/shop/son-of-a-patriot. And here's a couple of different shots of that mug. So I'm sorry I don't have the mug in my hand this morning. I neglected to grab it before I came into studio. So there it is. Go get yours. They're $16 plus shipping and handling. If you like to drink your coffee while listening to this show late in the evening, or whenever you listen to it. If you catch it in the archive the next morning, then there's the mug. And so you can go and get yours. So Etsy.com/shop/son-of-a-patriot. That's my Etsy site. And you can see all the other great stuff we've got over there, all the shirt designs, things. Generally, when I choose a topic on this show and we roll with it for several days or several weeks, I do a shirt that kind of commemorates that series. So you can kind of go over there and look. And I've also got patriotic tees there. All shirts are my designs. That's what I do for a living, folks. I am a graphic artist, I am a designer, I am an illustrator, an art director, a photographer, all of those things. So you can go take a look at that stuff over there. End of ad. Thanks for looking. Now let's get into this material because I've got a lot of stuff in front of me. But before I get into Solomon and his rings, there was something I wanted to look at. And that's, if you remember, let me show you one more photograph here. And again, sorry for those of you listening audibly that you won't be able to see this. But there is, where is it here? I want to find the Pool of Siloam. Here it is. This is, remember this picture from yesterday. This is the Pool of Siloam in Jerusalem, in the lower city of David. The city of David being Mount Ophel, which was the original city of David, about 13 acres. And this pool has been there. It connects up to the Gihon Spring, which feeds water to the city. And there is the street that we talked about of Pontius Pilate leads off of this area of the pool and goes all the way up through David City to the south end of the temple compound. Now, this pool was supposed to be a place where the angels would come and stir the waters, and so people would wait at the side of this pool for the angel to come, and then they'd jump in the water when the waters would tremble or stir, hoping to be healed of illnesses and things like this. And this is where, after the miracle of Jesus, where he healed the man who had been blind from birth, and he spit into a little mud in his hand and made a little paste out of it, clay paste, and put it on the man's eyes and told him to go wash your eyes in the Pool of Siloam, which he did, and he raised his head from the pool and he could see. And so this is that place, and that's still there. It's the Pool of Siloam. Now, excuse me. So the Pool of Siloam, there was a tunnel that the Gihon Spring fed into. And there was a king that was later in the time of Israel, after the time of David, after the time of Solomon, a couple of hundred years later, Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah carved out a tunnel, which you can walk through that tunnel today. It's an amazing bit of architecture. Pardon my cough. I don't have a cough button on my soundboard. All I can do is crank the sound all the way down. So that's one of the things. I've got to upgrade my equipment. I got to get something that's got a good cough button. So pardon me when I'm coughing a little bit. Now, Hezekiah's tunnel. I want to hit this for a couple of minutes before we get into Solomon. And to understand Hezekiah's tunnel in the city of Jerusalem and to truly appreciate this monumental feat that he achieved of engineering, some background's needed. Now, Judah, which is the kingdom to the south in in Israel. Israel is comprised of Judah and Israel in the north. And David was the one who unified them, loose unification. And then they split up again and they had their own kings. And so Judah, the kingdom to the south in Israel, had been reduced by Assyria to this vassal state after the time of David and Solomon. And as most of the world was at that time. But when Sargon, the king of Assyria, died, these suppressed kingdoms all started rebelling, as they do when they lose their leader that really subjected them in the first place. And they were crushed by his son Sennacherib and his armies. It's mentioned in the minor prophet book of Micah in the Old Testament. And Hezekiah was the king of Judah at this time. We're talking like the 720s to the late 690s BCE. And so this was about 200 years after the time of Solomon. And he refused to pay tribute to Sennacherib. Sargon's dead. Screw you. Thumb my nose. Shake my sandal at you. We're not going to pay your tribute anymore. And he trusted more in an alliance he'd made with Egypt instead. And this is mentioned in Isaiah 36. And the natural response to this rebellion, of course, was for Sennacherib to invade Judah, which prompted Hezekiah to agree to pay the tribute of 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. But he did so by stripping down the temple. He took all the gold and silver out of the temple to pay this tribute. And that's in 2 Kings 18. You can find that. Now, this concession was too little, too late, and Assyria marched on Jerusalem anyway. You can find that in Isaiah 36. And withstanding this siege would require ensuring that there would be enough water for the city to survive, which meant a tunnel would need to be dug from the spring. And you find this in the book of 2 Chronicles and chapter 32. Now flash forward 2,500 years to today, almost today. In 1880, a boy discovered an inscription on the tunnel wall while bathing. And it has since been removed to the Istanbul Museum. That's where they didn't stay with the country at the time, because Israel didn't exist at the time as a nation. And it explained the rare engineering feat of digging through solid bedrock with picks and axes and a bucket brigade. And it described two teams digging simultaneously from opposite directions. And when the tunnel was driven through, the hewers wielded the axe, each man toward his... this is the verse, by the way, from the inscription. And when the tunnel was driven through, the hewers wielded the axe, each man toward his fellow. There was heard a man's voice calling to his fellow. The hewers hacked to each other toward the other, axe against axe, and the water flowed from the spring to the pool, a distance of 1,200 cubits. Now, what was amazing about this engineering is when they came from two different ends using axes and picks and shovels and buckets to haul out the debris. They were only off by mere inches. There's the point where they met each other like the golden spike on the railroads, and you can see it today. It's only off by a mere inches, and you can see the tunnel is a little skewed from each other by a few mere inches where they met each other. That's how erudite the engineers were in making this thing happen. So in 1867, a man named Charles Warren conducted the first excavations of the Temple Mount, and he's credited with the discovery of the water shaft that brought water from the Gihon Spring into Jerusalem to the Pool of Siloam in 701 BC. And in honor of his work, it's also known as Warren's Shaft, and he was the first one to actually walk it in centuries. Now, according to his journal, it was fairly easy until about the 600-foot mark, when he and his assistant, Henry Birtles, had to crawl on all fours with a candle in his mouth. While Warren was taking notes, they noticed the water rising, leaving them with only inches of air to breathe. At the 900-foot mark, I'd get claustrophobic doing this, by the way, folks. I can't get into small spaces like that, especially if I know there's a possibility of drowning. But at 900 feet, they found the false turns that slowed them down before finally reaching the exit well after sunset. And they were wet and cold, but they'd done it. Now, although a remarkable walk, it's not as difficult as Warren's first trek. Still at 2 feet wide and 5 feet tall, it can be a little claustrophobic. I have friends who've been there, who've been through that tunnel. I have not experienced this yet, but you can walk through that tunnel. And on a summer day, the 63 degrees spring-fed water is refreshing, but not advisable during the winter months without a change of clothes, because you'll get wet. The water level rises from your ankles to your knees to your waist. You have to give yourself about a 40 to 60 minute walk to wade up the 1,740-foot tunnel and bring a flashlight with you. So if you don't want to get wet, you can take the dry Canaanite tunnel to the immediate left of the main tunnel, which was used for crop irrigation. It's narrow, but it's completely passable. And the source of the water's flow, the Gihon Spring, is also famous as the spot where Solomon was crowned king of Israel. Remember that during our, maybe you don't remember that, during our presentation on the life of David last summer. I did 17 episodes of that, which you can still find in archive here. We talked about Solomon being, before the death of David, who was sick and interred in his bed, interred, not interred in his bed. He was crowned king of Israel at the Gihon Spring. And so standing on the very ground where Solomon was anointed, something you can actually do as part of the underground, dry tunnel walk, it's an amazing sensation. So I've been told by a few people who've been there. You can also walk down the Herodian Street, also underground. This is what they used to call the Herodian Street, is the street of Pontius Pilate that we talked about yesterday. And myriads of Jews took up to the temple from the pool of Siloam, following this street that we mentioned yesterday. Spent the whole time on yesterday, which is the same path Jesus would have used 2,000 years ago. After you come out into the sunshine. Now, by the way, when I say that Jesus used, he probably walked on this street. It was a path before that, but it was Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, who ruled in Israel at the time of Jesus. Probably didn't build this thing until Jesus was already in his late 20s. So Jesus would have used this path after it was, and of course it was the Herodian path, and then later became the street of Pontius Pilate. And after you come out into the sunshine, you're met with huge piles of rubble that were cast down by the Romans when they destroyed the temple in 70 A.D. And you look up and you're going to see remnants of Robinson's Arch on the western wall. These are some of the archaeological things that have been done at the Temple Mount, even though because of Islam, archaeologists aren't really allowed to go in beneath the Temple Mount, what was the Temple Mount today, because of the Mosque of Omar that sits there. Now, these tunnels were the last hiding place during the Roman destruction, and the excavations in the tunnels even revealed a Roman sword in its leather sheath. Josephus, a historian from the first century, had a front row seat to this terrible event, and he had this to say about the tunnels, where 2,000 bodies were found. Josephus said, "At last and cherished hope of the tyrants and their brigand comrades lay in the underground passages as a place of refuge where they expected no search should be made for them, intending after the complete capture of the city and the departures of the Romans to come forth and make their escape. But this proved to be but a dream, for they were not destined to elude either God or the Romans, and every man who showed himself was either killed or captured by the Romans, and those trapped in the sewers were ferreted out, and the ground was torn up, and all who were trapped were killed." And the whole tunnel system exposes this aspect of Jerusalem that leaves you astounded at the engineering and the skill that was involved in creating this tunnel. And when you consider what it took to complete the construction above ground, that's so revered, what's beneath the city only adds to the marvel of the city of David. And so that's Hezekiah's tunnel, and that's connected to the pool of Siloam we talked about, and it brought water up to the temple and into the city. And so now, before we get into examining the temple, which is getting pushed out a day or two now, because I want to hit this stuff about Solomon. And King Solomon, and he was the son of David. Let me tell you a little bit about Solomon before we go forward. The biblical king Solomon was known for his wisdom, his wealth, his writings, and you can find his writings. The book of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon, although there's a lot of the Proverbs that are marked by other people in that, marked as belonging to or having been written by others. The book of Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, that very sexual, tepid book in poetic language of Solomon's love for the Queen of Sheba. Your breasts are like two-roed deer that run through the wilderness, kind of thing. That's some of the language in that book. And he became a ruler, the ruler of Israel, in approximately 967 BCE. And this is when he started work on the temple as well. And he was the son of David. Now, if you remember the series we did on David, I think there's an apologetic aspect to the story of Solomon gaining the throne and being the son of David, the son also of Bathsheba, the woman that David had an affair with and ended up killing her husband Uriah. And there is some thoughts that Solomon was actually that she was already pregnant with Uriah's child, and that Solomon was the son of Uriah, not the son of David. And the apologetic in the Old Testament, in the story of David, seems to set up a picture of things that wouldn't be known because they were private conversations. They were things that were, and all of this kind of reveals this apologetic of David possibly being lied to about Solomon in his old age, in his dotage, and how Bathsheba pushes the succession of Solomon as David lies dying. And so that's a totally other story. You can find that, again, over on my YouTube page. Just go down to the King David series, scroll through, you'll find the episode on Solomon and Bathsheba and David. And so he's the oldest son of David, as the Bible said. I'm sorry, he was the son of David, not the oldest, the son of David. But David promised Bathsheba that Solomon would be the next king. And when David's eldest son, Adonijah, declared himself the king, because he was the oldest son, David ordered his servants to bring Solomon to the Gihon spring, where the priest anointed him while David was still alive. Solomon inherited a considerable empire from his father, that his father had worked as kind of the warrior who established it all. And at first Solomon was faced with opposition. Two of David's eldest advisors, Joab the son of Zeruiah, and the priest Abiathar, sided with Adonijah when Adonijah came to Solomon and requested the king's servant as a wife. Solomon saw that this was a veiled threat to take over his kingdom, and he sent a messenger to Adonijah, and he banished Abiathar to the city of Anathoth. Too many A names right there in a row. And Solomon then followed his father's last instruction, in which David had ordered him to kill both Joab and one of his father's enemies, Shimei, the son of Gera. And Solomon was thus overcame the last potential threats to his new kingdom that he has now inherited. And he appointed his friends to key military, governmental, and regional religious posts. And what's very interesting about this, you see, is that even in David abdicating the throne and giving it to his son Solomon, he was admitting, I'm going to be dead any day now, so I'm going to have you take over. And the fact that he had him, he gave him orders to kill all his enemies. This shows a bit of the apologetic at play here. And so Solomon accumulated enormous wealth. He controlled the entire region west of the Euphrates River, all the way down into Israel. And it says he owned 12,000 horses, and stalls for 450 of them have in fact been found in Megiddo. And Solomon strengthened his kingdom through material alliances, and he had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and the empire was divided into 12 districts, and with Judah consisting its own political unit, and so on. That's some of the details of it. But Solomon was young, and he became known for his wisdom. And the first and most famous incident was his cleverness when the two women came who were disputing over whose baby it was. And Solomon threatened to split the baby in half. And one woman was prepared to accept the decision, but the other begged the king to give the baby instead to the woman who was disputing. And then Solomon knew the second woman was the mother, and he gave her the baby. And so on. So his wisdom. It seems like banal things sometimes when you think about it, but the way his wisdom was displayed was very new at the time. And so his downfall came in his old age. He had many foreign wives, and he allowed them to worship other gods. He built shrines for their sacrifices, and so on. And you can read all about this in the book of Ecclesiastes when Solomon talks about himself and his life. And so Solomon died in Jerusalem after reigning for 40 years. And he was the ruler of Israel. And he was buried in the city of David. And he is the man who constructed the first temple in Jerusalem. And we're going to talk about a little bit more about some of the legends surrounding Solomon when we come back. Sit tight. All right, folks, we're back. Welcome back to the program. After that break, this is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to go check out Odyssey Radio, all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. Find a place to listen to this show audibly. If you're not listening audibly, if you're listening on an archive or you're watching the video rebroadcast or video simulcast tonight, then go over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. Check out the schedule. All the shows that are there 24/7 to listen to. Now, you can also come over and join this broadcast in its simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join the chat room there, and you'll see a bunch of the other Intrepids that are there enjoying the show and talking up a storm right now as we're talking. So we're talking about King Solomon in relation to the fact that he is the man who built the first temple, which we're working our way up to talking about the temple itself and some of the legends behind that temple. And there were 3 of them in Jerusalem. The first one that Solomon built, then it was destroyed by the invading Babylonians. The people were carried off to Babylon. 100 years or so later, they're released, sent back home. They rebuild the walls of the city and the walls of the temple and rebuild the temple. And this is where the 72 rabbis also went to reconstruct the scriptures and the history of Israel at the Library of Alexandria, the product of which is the Septuagint, or the Septuaginta, which is the Greek, which was the language of commerce of the day, the worldwide language, post, of course, Alexander the Great. And they wrote the Septuaginta, which is your Old Testament in your Bibles, is the Septuagint translated into English if you speak English and other languages and so on. And so this is the period we're talking about. This is what happened there. We're going to lead up to the temple, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the legends and the myths behind Solomon. And Solomon, as it said, had his demons, his jongleurs, and the meeting of Islamic and Judaic and Christian culture all come together on these legends. And the legend of Solomon's special ability to control demons originated in Jewish, Hellenistic, or Greek, Greekanized, I guess is a way to say that, Jewish Hellenistic circles. And it became widespread in later Judaic, Islamic, and Christian culture. Now, first question you might want to ask is, why is this important to know, this information? I don't think it's important to know. You could go through your whole life and never talk about Jewish Hellenistic culture. You could go through your whole life and maybe even never mention the name of Solomon. You could go through your whole life and not worry one little bit about his rings and his signets and whether or not he controlled demons. But the first I had really learned of this stuff was way back, believe it or not, 20 years ago when the Lord of the Rings movies started coming out. And the one ring to rule them all, the ring of power. And somebody mentioned to me, that's like Solomon's rings. And I said, Solomon's rings? I had to go look that up and start reading through that and found out that there is, and I know in Templars and Masons, Masonic lore, that there is all kinds of mentions of Solomon having this ring that he used to control the demonic forces and used them to help him build the temple in Jerusalem, this grand, glorious temple. And by the way, I didn't mention the third temple that was built. They rebuilt the walls after the Babylonian captivity, and I went off on the 72 rabbis. And then that was rebuilt by King Herod in like about 6 or 7 BCE. A brand new sparkling temple. And that's the one that was then destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD and was never rebuilt. And that's supposedly the compound of the temple is where the Dome of the Rock, the Mosque of Omar, sits today. And so, talking about Solomon, though, and there was this special ability to control demons that it is said that he possessed. And it originated in this Jewish Hellenistic literature, and it became widespread later in Judaic, Islamic, and Christian culture. And now in the Quran, as well as in the earlier Babylonian Talmud and other rabbinic sources, the legend was adopted with this clear tendency to avoid the pragmatic, demonic aspects of the story. So in a similar vein, the Quranic commentators presented the relations between Solomon and the demons as an expression of the supernatural rule of the king over the cosmos, and it ignored his shameful end. And the inclusion of the legend in the most sacred canonical text of Islam and its connotation of eternity may explain the frequent representation in Muslim art. Now, on the other hand, the avoidance by the Christian establishment authorities and the relegation to profane literature mocking the king might account for its absence in Western official art. And a combination between the high and the low aspects of Solomon is seen as an illuminated medieval Hebrew Masor from South Germany. And that's where you find some of this stuff now. The divine aspect of Solomon as he appears in the Matzor is paralleled in Muslim examples. And these similarities are the result of close textual traditions deriving from the same sources. Yet, a possible pictorial testimony linking East and West might be discerned in the Ottoman illuminated book of Suleiman, which is the Arabic version of Solomon, and possibly based on Western tradition. And it's very interesting when you start looking into this, that if you follow the footsteps of other beloved creations of legend and folklore, the Islamic genie or the jinn, which we spent, believe it or not, that was 2 months ago already that we talked about the jinn, has now been irrevocably co-opted by Disney movies and cartoons and things like that. And future generations of children are going to undoubtedly envisage genies of the Arabian Nights as amorphous blue characters with the appearance and manic personality of Robin Williams. Now, of course, what's his name? The actor who played him in the new remake, Will Smith. But the original genie, or jinn, was, of course, a being of a different color, stemming from the hazy past of ancient Arabian paganism. And Muslim tradition enriched the jinn's profile by adding it to the features derived from the demons who inhabited the Jewish and the Christian lore, as well as more exotic South Asian, African civilizations, into which Islam subsequently penetrated. Now, the Quran, Islam, I'm mentioning this for a reason in relation to Solomon. The Quran, Islam's sacred scripture, mentions the jinn on several occasions. And some of the passages will evoke familiar associations versed in Talmudic legend, Jewish legend. And, for example, the Quran relates that King Suleiman, or Solomon, that his mastery of the languages of all creatures allowed him to regiment the hosts of humans, birds, and jinn under his command. And this echoes the Talmudic legends, how the wise king exercised dominions over the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and associated demons and supernatural beings to being under the control of King Solomon. Now, Solomon's sovereignty over the animal kingdom is derived from this reasonably straightforward manner in this biblical verse, such as 1 Kings 5:13, which says, "He spoke also of beasts, and of fowl, and of creeping things, and of fishes." But the tradition about Solomon's control over the whole supernatural realm was derived from imaginative midrashic exegetes of verses like First Chronicle, midrash being the Jewish writings, the rabbinic writings of the Jewish text. First Chronicles 29, Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord, is all that says. Ecclesiastes 2:8, where Solomon recalls how he accumulated shiddah or veshidat. It's an obscure expression that might refer to anything from a concubine to a cabinet, but which rabbinic midrash identified with the Hebrew word for demon, shed. So if Solomon accumulated shaddai, or shaddah, and veshidat, they're saying in midrashic tradition that this had to do with demonic forces. Now, the Quran also records stories about how Solomon harnessed the power of demons, or jinn, as they referred to them, and which, when we covered our series on the jinn, we learned that they really weren't demonic, and they were totally different kinds of creatures, but they have been interpreted as demons throughout the centuries, so that Solomon harnessed the power of the demons, the jinn, for his ambitious and demanding construction projects. There's a quote here that says, out of the Midrash, that says, "They made for him what he pleased of fortresses and images, and bowls large as watering troughs, and cooking pots that will not move from their place." This is speaking of the jinn who worked under the dominion of Solomon. Now, according to the Quran, Solomon died while leaning on his staff. But his demise didn't become known until a worm started to gnaw through the wood of the staff. And had the enslaved jinn known this fact, they would have not continued to labor for the king. So you see how mythological all of this starts to sound. And the big question we start to ask, because we know all myth and legend has at its headwaters a kernel of truth that launched that into a legendary status. So what really happened with Solomon is the question there. Several of the themes in that story can be traced to Talmudic writings. Rabbinic legend, the legends of the rabbis, tells us that Solomon was punished for his overbearing pride when he was impersonated by the demon king Ashmedai and removed from the throne in Israel. And in this early prototype of The Prince and the Pauper, you remember that story? Disney made a movie of it. It's an old storybook. The Prince and the Pauper, how these boys who looked exactly alike, not twin brothers, but they were doppelgangers of each other. One was the prince and the other one was the pauper in the streets, and they met each other and they decided to trade places. So it's kind of an early telling of that motif, that Ashdamai removed Solomon from the throne, took his place, and the real king was forced to wander the world as a beggar until, as the Midrash states it, nothing remained of his former magnificence except the staff in his hand. Now, one version of the tradition states that Solomon never regained his throne, never took his position as king ever again, and he died in abject poverty. A theory that's supported by a very literal reading of the book of Ecclesiastes 2:10. And this, says Solomon, only what I am now holding in my hand was the portion of all my labor, saying, my staff is the only thing I have left. And if you read the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, it was not removed as being non-canonical. It had to be, in a sense, voted on by all the priests and bishops to be included in the canon of the Bible during the different councils that were convoked in early Christianity. This book of Ecclesiastes is a very sad tale of the elderly king, probably close to his death, writing about his life and saying, I had all of these things. That's where we get the out of the book of Ecclesiastes, where he talks about all is vanity. Life is vanity. Everything I gained, everything I earned, everything I learned was all vanity and nothingness. And all I'm left with are faded eyes and teeth that are worn down and achy bones and joints. And all I have left in my hand is what's in my hand today, this staff he's talking about. And this is what the rabbinic scholars went on. Abject poverty was all he had. The worm in the Muslim story also recalls one of the more marvelous inhabitants of the Talmudic bestiary, the shamir, the miraculous worm-like creature that Solomon, with the unwilling assistance of Ashmedai, captured and utilized to cut the stones for the construction of the temple. Ashdamai, the kind of demon king that Solomon held in power because he wore the ring of power, which I don't have my ring of power on today. I've got my other rings. So the story of Solomon and Ashdamai resurfaces in the legends of 1001 Arabian Nights. And all of us are familiar with the propensity of genies to get stuck inside lamps and jars. And in at least one instance, the genie, the jinn, claims in the Arabian Nights to have been placed there by none other than King Suleiman or Solomon, and who sent his minister to seize me, and his vizier had bound and brought against my will to stand before the prophet Solomon as a suppliant. And when the jinn stubbornly refused to proclaim his faith in God, Solomon's God, Solomon had him imprisoned in the jar, which was sealed with lead, stamped with the royal signet ring, inscribed with God's name, and cast into the ocean. Now, this Arabic folklore shares many elements in common with the Talmudic story in which Solomon sends his chief minister, Benaiah ben Jehoiada, to capture Ashdamai, the king of the demons, the jinn. And Solomon continued to hold the demon in chains with the help of a magic ring. And it was by trickery, by tricking Solomon into lending him the magic ring, that Ashdamai was able to depose the king. And only after taking back that ring was Solomon, according to one version of the story, able to return to power. I'm always amazed at some of the old legends and myths, how easily the king who has the ring can say, "And this ring, and by this ring I hold power over you. And then you will always be under my dominion." And somehow gets tricked into, "Oh, sure, you can have my ring for a second. I need it right back." And this is how Ashtamai deposed the king and took his place, according to Talmudic legend. And so when it's all said and done, there's this unmistakable thread of continuity, twisted and complicated though it might be, that leads from the pages of the Bible and the Talmud to really the cartoon of Aladdin and the lamp, Aladdin, the genie. Yeah. And so it's interesting that Solomon is said to have possessed this ring, and on this ring was the seal of Solomon. Now, this is an interesting thing all by itself, this seal. I've got a bunch of material up in front of me here about the seal of Solomon. You can look at it from a clearly almost sterile academic point of view, the seal of Solomon. You can also look at it as something that was more magical. The seal of Solomon is a signet ring, and it was attributed to King Solomon in medieval Jewish tradition and in Islamic and Western culture and occultism. This was, of course, many centuries after the life and death of Solomon. And it was often depicted in either a pentagram or a hexagram shape. The latter also known as the Star of David in Jewish tradition. So you see the Star of David, you look at the flag of Israel today. White field with a blue bar on the top and the bottom, and the blue Star of David in the center. That's the hexagram. And this was the seal of Solomon. It's called the Star of David, but it was the seal of Solomon. And this ring variously gave Solomon the power to command demons. It was the ring he wore that gave him this power. Where do you think Tolkien got his idea for the Lord of the Rings? It all came from this ancient mysticism surrounding the power of the signet rings. Probably the source was Solomon for that mythology. And it gave Solomon power over the demons. He could command them. The jinn. He could speak with animals. He was a Dr. Dolittle of his day. And due to by the way, which is a movie I'm looking forward to coming out, Tony Stark, dead Iron Man, actor. Why is he slipping he plays Dr. Dolittle in a remake of the movie. I don't think it's a musical like Rex Harrison's movie was in the 60s, but Robert Downey Jr. There you go. Boom. So, due to the proverbial wisdom of Solomon, he had all this power to command demons, jinn, speak with animals, and due to that wisdom that he possessed, that he asked of God, his signet ring, or its supposed design, came to be seen as an amulet or a talisman or a symbol or character in medieval and Renaissance era magic and occultism and alchemy. I want to show you a picture here, which I did not prepare ahead of time. So let's see if I can pull this up for you fast enough. This particular image. I want to save this. This is a variation. This is like the, what do you call the magic symbols? I'm really bad on my words today, and I'm sorry about that. But it'll come to me as I'm talking. Let's see. I want to find this. I want to put this somewhere where I can save this and I can show this to you right now. Let's go over here, and I want to show you what this signet ring is said to have looked like. It has the... What is it that you inscribe? Somebody. What is it that you inscribe? It's a symbol. And I've talked about these many times. I've even made some of them. Sigil. Sigil. Oh, man. I don't know why that one slipped my mind. So this is the sigil that was created out of the seal of Solomon. And it doesn't look anything like the seal of Solomon, but this is what we've got. Let me find this image for you here. And I saved it right out here. I'm just doing this now, which I didn't do ahead of time. Now this, let me blow this up a little bit for you. This is said to be the Seal of Solomon, and that this was the thing that he had inscribed on his ring. And I'm looking for the seal of... Well, you all know what the Star of David looks like, so I don't have to actually get back into showing you a picture of the Star of David. But this is the Seal of Solomon, as seen in the 17th century grimoire, The Lesser Key of Solomon. And other than that, the hexagram, you've seen it, and I don't have pictures up of this to show you, but the hexagram being the Star of David, or Solomon as we've known it today. And the amulet, the talisman, had this symbol, this character, this sigil in medieval and Renaissance era magic and occultism and alchemy. So there you go. That is the Seal of Solomon as it came to be known in its occultic form. Now, the legend of the Seal of Solomon was developed primarily by medieval Arabic writers, who related that the ring was engraved by God, and it was given to the king directly from heaven. This is the story about it. And the ring was made from brass and iron, and the two parts were used to seal written commands to good and evil spirits, respectively. So, as the story goes, this ring is something that was given to Solomon by God to have power and dominion over demonics, over jinn, over animals, over languages, over all of these things. And in one take, a demon, it was either Asmodeus or Sakir, obtained possession of the ring and ruled in Solomon's stead for 40 days. Some variations of the tale ring of Polycrates from Herodotus. The demon eventually threw the ring in the sea, where it was swallowed by a fish and caught by a fisherman and served to Solomon to eat. And in Islamic eschatology, the beast of the earth is equipped with both the staff of Moses and the seal of Solomon, and it uses the letter to stamp the nose of the unbelievers. The date of the origin of the legends that surround the Seal of Solomon are really difficult to establish. It's known that a legend of a magic ring with which the possessor could command demons was already current in the 1st century A.D. Josephus, I've been having a lot of problems talking tonight. Josephus 8:2 tells of one Eleazar who used such a ring in the presence of Vespasian, the emperor of Rome. But the association with the name Solomon with such a ring is medieval, notwithstanding the 2nd century apocryphal text, the Testament of Solomon, which I have up here in front of me, which I wanted to refer to, which we're not going to get tonight because we're just about out of time. So the Talmud, in its Tractate Gritten, has a story that involves Solomon, Asmodeus, the demon king, and a ring with a divine name engraved on it. And we've got to pick this up tomorrow, folks, because we're out of time tonight, I'm sorry to say. So think about that. The interesting Bible stories, as we have found many times over, have more mystical stories that are below them or attached to them or are much darker than you might think. We're going to hit that more tomorrow and talk about that in greater detail. Thanks for being here tonight. Have a good night. We'll see you in about 23 hours.